with trauma, there often are changes in a person's brain and body. That brain structure can actually shrink slightly. This region of the brain no longer being able to form memories as effectively as it did before, especially around that trauma. What the person will often experience is often having fairly strong and intense negative emotions. It could be fear, anxiety, or sadness or guilt. They also may notice that they
Prescribe prescriptions to treat anxiety and depression. Do you think that is overprescribed?
It really depends on the particular mental health issue that we're talking about. In my personal opinion, I believe that access to quality mental health care and therapy is so hard that many individuals end up on medications because it's the quicker way to get an intervention to the person.
What does true healing look like after a trauma?
It's really important that people understand that whatever reactions they may be having, whether it's the depression or the anger or the avoiding things that remind them of the trauma, or having difficulty sleeping, having difficulty concentrating and staying organized, those reactions and those changes that take place right after the event, they do eventually dissipate over time. If they don't seem to be shifting, if we're getting several months out from the event and there really hasn't been any change, and or if they're even getting worse, that's usually an indication. And when you choose to participate in an evidence-based therapy that's been proven to be effective, it's not just possible that you're going to get better, it's highly probable that you're going to get better.
All right, so we have an amazing episode ahead of us. I'm excited. You can tell by the smile on my face. My name's Tyquon Jordan, co-founder and co-host of Dash Wellness.
I'm Carolyn Palmer-Wallace. I am also co-founder and co-host of this pod and of Dash Wellness.
All right, so before we get started, here's something to really think about. Why is it that some wounds never seem to fully heal? Maybe it's something that happened years ago, a loss, a betrayal, a moment that changed you, a life moved on, but somehow a part of you didn't. And today's episode is why we struggle to heal and what trauma, grief, and human connection teaches us about finding our way back to balance.
Yep, that's right. And today our guest is someone who's dedicated her career to helping people do exactly that. Dr. Megan Keys is a clinical psychologist, PTSD and trauma expert, and educator with over 20 years of experience. She specializes in evidence-based trauma treatments like cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy. It's truly the gold standards of recovery. And it's part of Upward Behavioral Health, where she helps adults heal from trauma, grief, and relationship distress.
All right, so Dr. Keys, before we dive in, we always love to start about, your story, what led you down your profession, and what made you so passionate about helping people understand the struggles of healing.
Um, at the time that I started graduate school, my doctorate program in psychology, I was pretty clear that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist and be a clinician and do therapy. I did not have a particular area of interest, though. I really went in fairly open-minded, unclear if I wanted to work with children or adults or what specific type of population or diagnosis. And I had an experience early on in graduate school that made a huge impact on me. In 1996, I was hired as a research assistant at Stanford University, and the study was looking at adult female survivors of childhood sexual assault, and they were comparing two different types of therapy, a trauma-focused therapy for PTSD and a more kind of present-centered supportive therapy. My role in that really was to do all the psychological assessments and testing for the women before the treatment, before they began treatment and afterwards. And the testing really made me understand what a huge, huge impact trauma could have on an individual. Even if it was just an isolated trauma that occurred decades ago, it could still be impacting that person in such huge and significant ways in their life. The other piece of the study that had a huge impact on me was about a year to 2 years into it when the women started completing treatment and I was doing their assessments to see how their symptoms had changed. It was very clear that one of these two therapies was working and it was working very, very well. These women were getting better. They had significant decreases in their symptoms, and some didn't even have a diagnosis of PTSD anymore. And so it was really that experience as a research assistant at Stanford that made me see that something so impactful and impairing was also so treatable, and that people truly could recover from PTSD. And that's really what put me on the path of wanting to focus my career in the evidence-based treatment of PTSD in adults.
That's really amazing for something that impacts so many and so many that are suffering in silence, right? Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, such meaningful work. So thank you for everything you've contributed to the field. It's quite amazing.
Oh, thank you. Well, like I said, I so appreciate you being willing to focus on this topic. I know trauma and grief are not easy topics for people to talk about or listen to. So I just so appreciate your investment in this and trying to shed some light on it.
Definitely. Yeah. And with that, I think we can hop into maybe one of our first facts of, and where we're going to be jumping into our discussion today. So here's something that really puts everything into perspective. The National Center for PTSD estimates that about 6% of adults in the US, which is about 15 million people, it's not a small number at all, will experience PTSD at some point in their lives. But trauma isn't always about one big event or one singular event, right? Sometimes it's the smaller, quieter experiences that can accumulate and leave us carrying pain that isn't even recognizable to a certain extent.
Dr. Keys, can you help us understand what actually happens in the brain and body after trauma?
So one of the things that we know about trauma is that it's a very profound experience in terms of it being deeply personal and multifaceted. It can really impact an individual at just about every domain: emotional, physical, psychological, spiritually, and interpersonally. We also know that with trauma, there often are changes that take place in a person's brain and body that can make it much more difficult to really process that life experience the way that a person would typically process most life experiences. So let me just start with talking about some of the key changes that happen in our brains if an individual experiences trauma or has PTSD. So, to date, research has really identified about three key changes that take place that are probably most central when we think about the impact trauma can have on a person and those PTSD symptoms. So, the first is that trauma really impacts our amygdala. So, our amygdala is a structure in the brain that essentially is our threat detection system. So, a way to think about it is just like the antivirus software on a computer that's always scanning for any type of security breach. That's what our amygdala does. It's always on the lookout for any potential threat. Trauma and PTSD tend to make the amygdala very hyperactive. It's no longer as efficient at discriminating between a real threat and something that's not necessarily a real threat. And because of that, that alarm system within our brain is getting kicked off at much, much higher rates than it typically did before the trauma. And what that means for the individual and their experience of it is that many individuals who've experienced trauma and have PTSD find that they often feel very anxious, very on edge, hyper alert, like they always sort of need to be prepared and ready to react if something bad happens. They may notice a lot of frequent feelings of fear. And so that's really kind of one change that we see in the brain in terms of that threat detection system really becoming overactive. The next change we tend to see, and one of the well-established ones, is to change with our hippocampus. And so the hippocampus is a structure in our brain that's really involved in the formation of memories, especially new memories. What research has shown is that trauma exposure and in individuals with PTSD, that brain structure can actually shrink slightly. And what that means then is that it's no longer as efficient or proficient in forming new memories. So what that means for the person is that for many individuals who have experienced a trauma and have PTSD, that actual experience of a trauma and that memory of a trauma isn't really able to be processed in the way other memories are, even memories of other distressing life events. And so what we see is that individual will often notice that they have these very fragmented and kind of intrusive memories of the trauma that feel very out of control. They sort of will pop up out of the blue. Sometimes they'll get triggered, despite the best person's best efforts at trying not to think about the trauma or remember the trauma. This memory keeps coming back with a lot of intense emotion. And that's really a function of this region of the brain no longer being able to form memories as effectively as it did before, especially around that trauma. And then the final area where we really see changes with trauma exposure is with our prefrontal cortex. And so this is essentially the part of our brain that's in charge of our executive functioning. And what that means is this is the part of our brain that really helps us with attention and concentration, decision making, emotional regulation. We can experience strong emotions, but they don't necessarily overwhelm us. And what we see are the changes there is that that part of the brain simply isn't able to work again as well or as efficiently as it did before. And because of that, what the person will often experience is often having fairly strong and intense negative emotions. It could be fear, anxiety, or sadness or guilt. They also may notice that they sometimes have difficulty with tasks that before were just a bit easier for them, like sustaining attention and concentration or making decisions. And so those are probably three key ways that we see the brain really impacted by trauma and how those changes in the brain kind of directly translate to a lot of the symptoms that individuals can feel following trauma exposure with PTSD.
Megan, that's so fascinating, and I know it's something that a lot of our viewers are going to be able to relate to. And I think one point that you mentioned about how these brain changes manifest themselves in very real ways and physical ways and outward ways that can affect others around the person that is experiencing that. It's something that we should all be sensitive to and keep in mind, right? It may not be as simple as, just put a smile on your face, right? There are a lot deeper things that are happening quite literally on a mental, but also physical and neurological level. So,
Absolutely. And I think a piece of it too is while we talk about the changes with the brain, it also just impacts general bodily changes because of that amygdala, that threat detection system. Now, like we said, sort of being hyperactive and going off much more frequently. Part of what we see is that for individuals, that really impacts the nervous system. That amygdala is what really, when it alerts that there's a potential threat, that's what kicks off our fight or flight response. That basic stress response we all have that's there to protect us. We're driving down the highway and a car cuts in front of us. It's that fight or flight response that allows us to react so quickly and keep ourselves safe. But for individuals who've experienced trauma exposure and have PTSD, when that fight or flight response gets activated by the amygdala so frequently, there really becomes a level of physiological arousal in their body that just doesn't ever simply return to baseline. So for a lot of individuals with PTSD, there's a level at which that they are just almost chronically experiencing, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, rapid or shallow breathing. And a lot of times they may notice it in the moment if there's like acute level of anxiety. But even at baseline, we tend to see that those of physiological experiences tend to be higher in individuals with PTSD because that fight or flight response is activated so frequently. And it absolutely has an impact on their mood, their behaviors or thoughts, and their relationships. We tend to see folks who are a little more on edge, maybe a little more irritable, maybe a little more snappish, and certainly, more fearful and anxious, even in their personal reactions. A change in tone of voice, a look on somebody's face could very much be read as a potential threat when in fact it may not be, but the person will act accordingly.
mhm. Yeah, that's a great segue into the next area that we're hoping you can help us decode a bit. One thing we've learned uh, through our experiences is that emotional pain doesn't stay in one area of our lives. It does venture out to our relationships, and it impacts the people that are around us, whether it's caused by losing a loved one or losing a relationship, someone who even the person losing the person that you were before the trauma, even, right? And so grief can really shape how we interact with others. More specifically, research in the Journal of Traumatic Stress shows that unresolved grief and trauma can lead to relationship distress. Not because people stop caring, of course, but it changes how they're able to connect sometimes. How does that show up in the people that you work with, maybe more directly? And how do grief and trauma affect the way that we communicate, the way we trust, the way we relate to others?
Well, there's a lot of overlap with grief and trauma and how it can impact interpersonal connectedness. There's also a couple really distinct differences. So
Mm.
I think the first thing to keep in mind is that for many individuals, when they experience grief or trauma, it can be a very isolating experience. They may have a tendency to withdraw and kind of isolate simply because of being kind of overwhelmed by the experience. But we also know that that type of isolation is really something that can make the emotional pain and distress worse. So that tendency to sometimes want to withdraw is very natural following a significant loss or a traumatic experience. But we know it's also one of the worst things the person can do from the standpoint of recovery and healing. The other piece to keep in mind is that because there's still a level of societal stigma, not just around mental health, but specifically around trauma and grief, that can really get in the way of individuals being able to get the support that they need, whether it be reaching out to family and friends to discuss these things or really seeking professional help. And so we have kind of a couple different things there that can really contribute to individuals not being able to seek connection or connect with people at a time when they really need to. If that makes sense, just some blanket ways that this will impact it. With trauma specifically, and when we really look at the impact on relationships and communication, one of the things that we know, and there's definitely some overlap with grief as well, is that when people experience these really profound life events like trauma and loss, it can really destabilize their sense of safety, their sense of trust, their sense of control, like some of their most basic beliefs about themselves and others and how the world operates and how the world works can really get upended by these types of profound life experiences. And because of that, that can really have an impact on their relationships, be it relationships they're already in or forming new ones. And so just to use trust as an example, and we see this a lot in PTSD, it's certainly trauma can certainly undermine a person's trust in other people, period. But when we look at interpersonal trauma, so sexual assault, intimate partner violence, child abuse, a trauma where there really was a personal betrayal, we know that that can even impact a person's ability to trust others even more. And if we know that that type of trauma happens in childhood, well, then it has an even earlier impact, especially at an age where a child may not have the ability to really understand or make sense of what happened to them. The other piece of trust that a lot of time gets overlooked is within PTSD and trauma, there's a sense of losing trust in others, but there's also a sense of losing trust in yourself. So for a lot of individuals with PTSD, there's a lot of self-distrust in the sense that they may not really trust their judgment that much anymore. They may not really trust their decisions or their ability to handle themselves in difficult situations. And a lot of that is the impact of some, I'm going to call it faulty or kind of inaccurate beliefs about the trauma that we see occur. Many individuals with PTSD blame themselves for the trauma, so there's a lot of guilt and a lot of self-blame, even though, as we all know, anybody who could prevent or stop a trauma most certainly would. The nature of trauma is that it's, unpredictable, unpreventable, and uncontrollable. So, of course, the individual is not to blame for the trauma that occurred to them. But that's a really common shift that we see in a lot of individuals following a trauma and with PTSD. And that can absolutely impact their ability to trust their judgment going forward, including their judgment in the people that they connect with, the people that they trust, and the people that they confide in, which makes a barrier to seeking support and help even greater.
We have family members that have went through grief at a young age. They lost their uh, mother, and you can kind of see how the grief played out in their life, grew up and acted maybe different than if their parent was there. And sometimes, you can see it's a hard place. Like I couldn't imagine losing my mom that young. I wouldn't be the person I am. But at what point talk to them and say, okay, this happened, but you have to kind of move on and progress with your life. There's people that are using, I lost this person. This is why I'm like this. I didn't have that support, and they can't move forward.
Yeah. So I would say one of the things that we know with grief, and this is actually, I'm going to keep toggling back before grief and trauma because this is one of the areas where there's a lot of overlap. What research tells us with regards to trauma, but also with regards to loss and grief, is that the vast majority of individuals, the typical response to stress, adversity, trauma, and loss is resilience and recovery. The vast majority of individuals do naturally recover on their own. Almost everyone will have some set of, we can call it trauma reactions or grief reactions, but they are just simply that negative impact of that life experience, that shift in emotions, intense negative emotions, frequent thoughts about the event, even though it's unpleasant, possibly some avoidance. We see a whole kind of there's a wide range of reactions that people can have to trauma and grief. But what we know is that for most individuals, even in the midst of those reactions, there's a natural recovery process that starts to take place. And as they navigate those reactions and keep progressing forward with their lives, the natural recovery occurs and they do actually recover from that life event. So, just to give you an example, and Carolyn, you kind of cited some of these statistics at the beginning. So, what we know is in the United States, about 60% of men and 50% of women will experience at least one traumatic incident in their lifetime. But only about 6 to 8% of US adults will have a diagnosis of PTSD. Similar with grief. Everyone experiences loss and grief. We do know that the vast majority naturally recover on their own without any lasting impairment or need for intervention. About 10 to 15% of individuals have difficulty adapting to a loss and essentially become kind of stuck in that grief process. And what those numbers just tell us is that these are life incidents that most people naturally recover from. And for those that weren't able to recover naturally, what we know is that something typically got in the way of that recovery. It was not necessarily something inherent to that person that they just aren't capable of coming to terms with and recovering from these life events. It's usually something got in the way on that path to recovery that got them stuck. And for a person with trauma, if they get stuck in the middle of those trauma reactions and aren't able to progress forward, those trauma reactions essentially become PTSD. Following a loss, if they get kind of stuck in the middle of those grief reactions and aren't able to progress forward to recovery, that can often lead to what's now called prolonged grief disorder, which is essentially really significant and lasting grief symptoms, as well as other issues like depression. And so I would say that's probably the first thing for people to really keep in mind, especially from the standpoint if they feel like there is a loss or trauma that's still really impacting them, is to really help them understand chances are it's that something got in the way of your recovery process that you aren't aware of. And part of what treatment will do is help get you back on that path to recovery. Only this time, instead of it happening naturally, it's going to happen through a treatment process.
Yeah, I'm so glad you focused on and explained the hopefulness of the situation, right? And
Mhm.
how naturally we're inclined to rebound. And um, as you mentioned, for those who aren't necessarily healing naturally, or they do have those obstacles or roadblocks, as you mentioned, a majority of people who receive treatment for these traumas do see improvements. And I think there was a study by National Alliance that showed that more than 80% of people that went through treatment saw improvements within just a few months. So the healing is possible. And thank you so much for
Absolutely.
emphasizing that. And I'm curious, I think you've alluded to some of it a bit already, but what does true healing look like after a trauma? And what does it really mean to move past and be able to thrive and not just survive, right? So if we have this natural inclination to move on and to get past it, how do we then thrive through it?
So I think there's a couple different approaches to this depending on if we're talking about a loss or trauma. So I think the first thing that I would highlight about the recovering from it and naturally recovering from it is that first, the thing that's really important for people to understand is that those reactions, whether it be the grief reactions, the trauma reactions after this life experience, they're very normal. It's really important that people understand that whatever reactions they may be having, whether it's the depression or the anger or the avoiding things that remind them of the trauma, or having difficulty sleeping, having difficulty concentrating and staying organized, whatever reactions they may be having, those are really normal reactions. And it's not that my gosh, they've been permanently damaged or broken by this experience. We often couch these as these are ordinary reactions to a very extraordinary experience, like a trauma or a significant loss. So I think the first thing is really helping normalize and validate what people are going through. Trauma and loss are big life experiences, and they have big reactions, and that's normal and that's okay. I think the next piece that's really important for people to understand is that the degree to which they can, as they're experiencing these various reactions, try to seek social support with people that they trust or feel comfortable with, can try to not avoid thinking about the loss, feeling about the loss, talking about the trauma, those are things that can really help people start to move forward. We know that with both trauma and grief, it's that avoidance of trying to shut down the feelings because they're overwhelming and they're painful, that avoidance of talking about or sharing the experience with others so that they can't get that support that they need. Those are things that can absolutely help kind of disrupt that recovery process. So I think helping people be aware of how avoidance can be so detrimental, even though it's so natural to want to avoid these things. And avoidance is tricky because it works in the short term, right? Like, gee, if I crowds make me anxious and I walk into a grocery store on a Saturday and it's super crowded and my anxiety goes up, if I walk out of the store, my anxiety is going to go down. Avoidance worked until the next time I'm in a situation with a crowd and I walk in and my anxiety is going to go right back up and even higher. So it's really important for people to understand that piece, that as much as that natural inclination is to avoid a lot of these thoughts and feelings and discussions, it's actually being able to approach those things and experience that's going to help them move forward. Um, and in terms of really kind of knowing how you're recovering, I would say that with both of these life experiences, we do know that a lot of those reactions and those changes that take place right after the event, they do eventually dissipate over time. And so I would say that that's one thing that a person can kind of want to be aware of and kind of even doing a little bit of self-monitoring is, my gosh, right after a significant loss, if I notice that most of the time my emotions are pretty negative, pretty sad, pretty intense and overwhelming. But over time, suddenly, they aren't quite as overwhelming as they used to be. And suddenly, oh, it's a little more balanced. I'm finding myself looking forward to something. I'm finding myself laughing at a joke. You can start to kind of see those shifts and that balance come back into place. Same way with the frequent thoughts. Really, really common with loss and trauma that people, even though they may not necessarily want to think about it, will often have really frequent thoughts about the event. And usually over time, if a person is kind of progressing forward with recovery, we'll see some of those thoughts start to kind of descend and come down. So I think part of it too is just kind of watching those reactions and seeing them shift over time. If they don't seem to be shifting, if we're getting several months out from the event and there really hasn't been any change at any level in any of those, and or if they're even getting worse, that's usually an indication that professional help may be warranted, at least to determine if there's a formal diagnosis and if treatment is needed.
Yeah. And I assume you work with a lot of military personnel as well.
I
This.
have during the time that I was with the
Mhm.
VA, yes, I did a lot of work with veterans and service members, but I've also done a lot of work in the private sector also. So I've worked with both.
Okay. Yeah. Because, there's an immense amount of trauma with, you know, military and
Oh,
and things like that. I'm just
absolutely.
curious, is there, besides, the support groups and stuff, is there, other tactics that you use to help people with like severe trauma going through that?
Yeah, so I would say really when we talk about PTSD and we talk about treatment options, where we are right now, kind of in the field of trauma and with PTSD treatment, is we're in a pretty solid place. We have we have several evidence-based therapies for PTSD. And so let me back up 1 second. One thing that's really important for people to understand, and I feel like this is something I can never stress enough, is that a lot of times I think there's a lot of kind of misconceptions about therapy. I think sometimes people really view it as simply a supportive conversation, somebody who's listened to you and can be empathic, and you kind of have the floor, and that's that therapist is there really is your support. I think the flip side is sometimes there really is this idea that therapy is this sort of mystical, mysterious, like we don't know what happens, but somehow somebody manages to get better. The truth is, therapy is a science. It truly is a science. And what we've seen within our field, and especially in the area of PTSD, is we have several evidence-based treatments. And what that means is these are therapies that have been researched and backed by science. They have been proven to be effective. And the reason pursuing or investigating an evidence-based treatment is so critical is because when we say that these are evidence-based, this isn't just like, oh, there were a few studies and people got better. These are true scientific studies, similar to the types that we would run on, like FDA does on drug approval. We're looking at randomized controlled trials. We're looking at studies that have been done that where, it's a blind study to reduce prejudice. If they're going to be published in well peer-reviewed journals. Essentially, we have a committee of experts who really kind of kicks the tire on that study to make sure the design was solid, it was implemented correctly, those results are valid before they get published. So when we talk about an evidence-based study, it is truly a therapy that has been proven to be effective by science. And when you choose to participate in an evidence-based therapy that's been proven to be effective, it's not just possible that you're going to get better, it's highly probable that you're going to get better. And so I just can't emphasize that piece enough. Whether you're treating trauma or grief or anxiety or OCD, please, please look into evidence-based treatments. With regards to PTSD specifically, two of our leading evidence-based treatments right now, these are what we consider our first-line treatments, are cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy. And those two treatments that I've been doing for over 20 years, both as a clinician and training and providing consultation for clinicians learning these treatments. I worked with the National Center for PTSD's their prolonged exposure therapy program for 16 years as an expert consultant and provided, clinical oversight and guidance to VA therapists that were learning this treatment. These treatments have been found to be more effective in treating PTSD than medication and other types of PTSD therapies. So I would say that's the other thing, especially for individuals with fairly severe PTSD or have been struggling with it for quite some time. Really considering one of these first line treatments is probably about your best foot forward in terms of trying to promote recovery as quickly as possible.
This has been an amazing talk, conversation. We explored healing, why healing's hard, how grief shapes relationships, connection. Um, and, what really stands out to me is that healing both takes courage and community, and you don't, have to have it all figured out. As humans, we want to have everything figured out, mapped. So, um, Dr. Key, before we close, what's one message you'd want listeners to carry with them, especially those who have tried to heal, but keep getting pulled back into that old pain.
The most important pieces for individuals to take away from today is that with both trauma and loss, or loss and grief, recovery is possible. With an effective treatment, it's more than possible, it's probable. But it's also important to remember that with both of these issues, these are deeply personal, complex experiences that individuals have in their life. There is not a clearly designated timeline for healing. And yes, even when you get into treatment, sure, there'll be somewhat of a timeline in the sense of, gee, we know these treatments usually last about a dozen sessions, but there's still a lot of variability even within that, depending upon the individual and what else they're bringing to the table along with that PTSD or prolonged grief. And so I think the biggest thing that I just want people to realize is it's not too late. There's nothing wrong with you that you haven't been able to recover from these things. We know these are life experiences people naturally recover from. Something got in your way, and part of treatment is going to be figuring out what that is and figuring out how to help you remove it and work around it. And then finally, there's just simply no reason to continue to have to deal with the negative impact that PTSD or prolonged grief have in your life when we have really effective treatments available. There's just no reason. You can get better if you're able to find and kind of choose to participate in one of these treatments.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's a huge takeaway, Megan. I think that it's really important for people to hear that, and that, it's. I really loved what you spoke to about the evidence-based treatments. As someone, I've been in pharma my whole career, like that speaks to me very heavily. So thank you for that, and thank you for reminding people that this isn't a perfect journey necessarily. It's tailored to the individual, and it's not about pretending, right? It's really just about getting what treatment works for you.
There's every reason to be hopeful that if you engage in an effective treatment, you're going to get better. You're going to see positive changes, usually sometimes even within a matter of weeks to a month. And so I think that is something that just simply that is not enough a part of our national dialogue around mental health. I would think we're very good now at recognizing the problems. We're not as great about really advocating and promoting the solutions. And that's that with evidence-based treatment, you have incredibly solid treatment options that promote recovery.
I have one last question, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah.
Just curious, because a lot of times in medicine, I work in the healthcare. Um, a lot of people overprescribe prescriptions to treat certain like anxiety and depression. Um, do you think that is overprescribed, or could there be like other ways of going about it?
Think that depending on the mental health condition, sometimes the medications, it's not just that they're needed, but they are the most effective type of therapy. So I think that with some mental health conditions, like if we look at like schizophrenia, like that's something where we really know medication is kind of the leading evidence-based therapy for it that's the most effective. Now, when we look at things like depression, so what we really know is that certain types of antidepressants combined with cognitive behavioral therapy, that is the combination that has the most evidence behind it. Then PTSD. We know that with cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy, that's even more effective than medications. So it really depends on the particular mental health issue that we're talking about. I would say, and this is just solely my personal opinion, but what I would say, especially now in a private practice and working more exclusively in the private sector and with community providers, I believe that access to quality mental health care and therapy is so hard that many individuals end up on medications because it's the quicker way to get an intervention to the person. And that is a systemic problem. But I would say that's just one thing that has been a real eye-opener to me in my transition from, the federal healthcare system to working in a private sector is the degree to which accessibility to therapists and skilled therapists and qualified therapists is really limited, and it's something that definitely needs to be improved upon within our country, without a doubt.
And you have so much knowledge, and I can tell you're passionate about your profession. Where can people find you that are listening that say, "Hey, I want to get, you know, learn more about Dr. Keys"?
So, so the private practice that I'm a member of is called Upward Behavioral Health. Our website is just that, upwardbehavioralhealth.com. Um, we do for folks who are interested. One of our goals, in addition to really providing evidence-based therapies, that's really all we provide. We're a small practice of a group of clinical expert. Each of us are experts in our respective areas, and we really provide the leading evidence-based therapies for specific issues like PTSD or OCD or insomnia. But part of our goal also is to really help raise awareness and educate the public about mental health treatment and evidence-based therapies. So our website, we do monthly blogs. I'm our social media director, and so we do a lot on social media of trying to share research studies, really break things down to make them user-friendly so people can start to understand the science behind psychology and therapy. And so I would say, if you do have an interest in kind of generally what we talked about today and learning more about this, my goodness, feel free to visit our website or follow us on socials, because that's another big goal for us, is to really raise the bar on the public's expectations and in terms of what they can get in therapy and mental health care.
Yeah, and we'll put the descriptions and the links so they can just find you real quick and Upward Behavior Health.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, I so appreciate you reaching out with the invitation today. It's been great chatting with y'all about this. And like I said, I love what you're doing with Dash Wellness, with really shining a light on so many of these topics.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, and um, everyone can check out links in the description to start your journey with Dash Wellness today as well. We're here to help manage stress, educate folks with professionals such as Dr. Keys, rebuild balance, strengthen your emotional health, one mindful step at a time. So we're so excited to have had you and to have spoken with you, Dr. Keys. Tyquan, anything else you wanna add before we close?
That's it. Go visit upwardbehaviorhealth.com right now. So